Naomi Klein is here. She writes an internationally syndicated column for The Nation and The Guardian. Her first book, No Logo, sold more than 1 million copies worldwide. Her new book is called The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. I am pleased to have her here at this table for the first time. Welcome.
Thank you, Charlie.
Now, since you wrote No Logo, what have you been doing in the interim? Traveling, writing, thinking?
Hanging out. No, yeah. Writing columns, reporting, made a documentary film called The Take in Argentina, and working on this book. This book took me 4 years to write. Yeah. And
because you were waiting for a big idea, or knowing that a big idea might come and hit you in the face?
Well, I think I think there are too many books out there, to be honest.
Oh, yes.
And I think a lot of people...
And I hear from every one of them.
Yeah. No, but, obviously after No Logo, there was a lot of pressure on me to churn out another one. And I just know that feeling of disappointment when somebody writes a book that's really important to you, and then they do a follow-up book, and it's not as good. Yeah. And so I didn't want to just... people were always asking me after No Logo, which is a book about corporate branding, are you your own brand? Yeah. And it was true that it was sort of happening after No Logo, and I did do a collection and was doing a lot of public speaking. A collection of your own essays and writing. Yeah, and I just thought, okay, I'm going to sabotage my brand, and just, drop out of this and do something really different. And this book is very different than No Logo, and I don't think I'm a brand anymore.
Okay. And how did it happen?
This project? Yeah. Well, it came out of, I was in Argentina working on this documentary film with my husband, Avi Lewis, right. And it was 2002 when we moved to Buenos Aires, and it was about a shock that hit that country, and the way in which the country responded, the economic crisis, where people were locked out of their bank accounts, and they overthrew 5 presidents in 3 weeks, and it was a moment where, because the war in Afghanistan was going on and because the war in Iraq was gearing up, all the journalists were leaving Latin America and they were going somewhere else. So we decided to just stay and document this process. And the war in Iraq began, and it was a really interesting time and place to watch this unfold, because Latin America was going through this process of transformation that we've seen this leftward shift. And Latin America was really rejecting what I, in the book, call corporatism, because I don't believe it's a free market system. I think it's really a collusion between corporations and governments. But policies of privatization, free trade, were being rejected all over the continent, and Latin America maybe more than anywhere else in this period. And so suddenly the war in Iraq begins, and the same policies that were being rejected in Latin America were being imposed on Iraq, but now with brutal force. So there was the shock and awe invasion, and then Paul Bremer arrives, announces Iraq is open for business, pushes through, unilaterally, no negotiations, a kind of tsunami of policies, making Iraq, in the words of The Economist magazine, a capitalist dream, the most liberal foreign investment laws in the world. And I just thought, okay, is this the new face of free trade? Don't ask, just seize new markets on the battlefields of preemptive war. And it was really stark, because Bolivia, for instance, had just thrown out the company Bechtel, right, because Bechtel had privatized the water system, and water prices had gone up 300%, and there was this huge open, they called it the water wars, this uprising against Bechtel. And lo and behold, Bechtel shows up in Iraq, and they're reconstructing the water system there.
Huge contract.
Yeah, a huge contract. So I wrote my first column about Iraq from Argentina called Privatization in Disguise, robbery disguised as reconstruction. And that was sort of the seed of the idea that turned into the shock doctrine. At first, I went to Iraq from Argentina and reported for Harper's Magazine an article called Baghdad Year Zero. And it was this dream of this confusion, really, at the heart of the Bush administration, that somehow by bombing Iraq, you would have a clean sheet. Rather than rubble, it would just be this pristine landscape, and you could just reboot the country, start from zero. And I was reporting on how that had backfired, so that was the, I guess, the DNA of the book is in that Iraq reporting, but then I've extended it to a much broader terrain.
And broader in this sense, which is you take on natural disasters, tsunami and Katrina, and notice some of the same tendencies.
Yeah, I mean, that's when I decided
Our instincts.
that it was a book. I mean, this is the, the difference between a magazine article and a book, and the reason why I had, a book is something that's too big for a magazine article, right? And so I had written that long magazine article for Harper's about the shock therapy in Iraq and the attempt to harness the dislocation following the shock and awe to push through economic shock therapy. And what I mean by the shock doctrine, just to be clear, is the idea that the best time to push through these very unpopular economic policies is in the aftermath of some sort of crisis or shock that sends people reeling, confused, focused on day-to-day emergencies so that they can't actually engage in a debate about whether they want them or not. So that's the strategy. And I thought it was specific to Iraq, this use of shock and awe to push through shock therapy. But then I found out that the same thing was happening in Sri Lanka after the tsunami, the so-called Boxing Day tsunami in 2004. So I went there after I returned from Iraq to see how the reconstruction process in Sri Lanka would compare to what I had seen in Iraq. And I found something really striking. I found out that 4 days after the tsunami, and if we remember that the terrible footage that we all saw of twisted up trains and highways, and in Sri Lanka 40,000 people lost their lives, almost 500,000 people were displaced. Well, 4 days after the wave hit, the government pushed through a law preparing the ground for water privatization, which is the most controversial of these policies. They also went for electricity privatization, so-called labor market flexibility.
And you also make the case with the tsunami that what happened after that, people came in and converted, which had been places for villages, into resorts.
Oh, yeah.
And after Katrina, they converted schools into...
Exactly. Yeah. So after the tsunami, you had all these people, hundreds of thousands of people, moved to inland evacuation camps in the name of safety and security. Said that they were worried. The government said they were worried that another wave could come, so they were being protected inland, and they couldn't rebuild on the coast. And there was a law that was passed called the buffer zone, keeping fishing people from rebuilding, and who were overwhelmingly the victims of the tsunami. And that makes sense, right? But when I was there was a huge amount of construction going on all along the coast, and it was resort developers and other industries. So, I interviewed many people in the tourism sector, in the tourism ministry, and I heard the same thing I'd heard in Iraq: blank slate, clean sheet, this confusion between destruction and creation. And so I wrote an article actually using the phrase disaster capitalism. Yeah. And when the levees broke in New Orleans, I was already working on the book. But what was amazing was to hear people in New Orleans suddenly start using the phrase. Jesse Jackson went there and said, what we're seeing here is disaster capitalism. He was talking about the fact that the school system was being privatized, and the public housing projects were being turned into condominiums. So it wasn't, the phrase disaster capitalism, I think some people think is just about Halliburton and Blackwater. And it's about that too. But I'm talking about something more radical, which is really using disasters to push through kind of social engineering.
Connect this to Milton Friedman.
Okay. I know you had a great deal of respect for him. And,
I did.
And the way I connected to Milton Friedman is that Milton Friedman believed, and he told you this, I actually rewatched an interview between the two of you recently, that he believed that the only acceptable role for the government was to protect private property, enforce contracts, and defense.
I should say this: Milton Friedman and I disagreed on lots of things.
I know.
We just admired each other,
yeah,
because we'd engaged each other so many times.
No, that was clear. And but he explained this radical vision of the world where the role of government was simply to protect private property and enforce contracts. And Milton Friedman, by his own account, when he wrote Capitalism and Freedom, which was his sort of original manifesto, calling for the privatization of the post office, national parks, right, and pretty much everything.
Yeah, he went further than any politician I know.
Well, actually, Donald Rumsfeld studied under him. Yeah. He audited his courses and referred to himself as a young pup studying at the feet of geniuses. And actually, Donald Rumsfeld went further, because Milton Friedman did believe that it was acceptable for the government to be engaged in policing, yeah, and military. And Donald Rumsfeld, he took this further and did some radical outsourcing and privatizing of military and police. So I would say Donald Rumsfeld outdid his mentor. But we can come back to that.
Yeah, that's some interesting things about that, because we had a recent guest who's now named Kip Ward, a 4-star general, an African-American, who's now been put in charge of something called AFRICOM, in which they are using a whole range of different aspects of government. But the military is involved in this, and it was created by Rumsfeld. But the notion is to involve the military in things beyond sort of national security and beyond sort of boots on the ground kind of stuff, which is an interesting sort of tangent to our story. Let me raise it. Friedman inspired so many people. He won a Nobel Prize, inspired so many people. And how did they push this argument out? And how did it find itself in different countries around the world?
Well, Milton Friedman, he won a Nobel Prize for his academic work, for his work on the money supply.
Right, monetarist.
But he was very clear that he really did play two roles. One of this sort of more strict academic role, and the other was as a popularizer for these radical free market ideas. He identified himself as a radical. That's why he didn't like being called a conservative, because he wanted radical change. But
he understood, the point is, he understood and articulated the idea that the time to change is in the aftermath of disaster, when there is a shock doctrine in place.
Well, I start the book with a quote from Friedman that says, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change."
My point exactly.
Exactly. He understood this because he had had some really negative experiences with democracy, most notably under Nixon, where here was this U.S. president who Milton Friedman wrote in his memoirs. He couldn't imagine a U.S. president more ideologically in line with him. He had access to the Oval Office. He had several of his disciples in key positions. And then
engaged in wage and price controls.
And then they imposed wage and price controls. And Friedman pronounced him the most socialist president that the United States had ever had. So the point of, I think he was very disillusioned, and I know he talked about this with you as well. I mean, he really carried this with him. This was a profoundly disillusioning experience. And to me, my book is about, it's a challenge to the official story of how Friedman's ideas spread throughout the world.
That's my point.
The official story is that they spread through freedom and democracy. And I think Milton Friedman's genius in the realm of what I would call propaganda was in equating freedom, democracy, and capitalism. But in his more strategic role, in his more political role, he would admit, actually, we need a crisis to push this through, because democracy is actually democracy. What we think of as democracy, it's not just laborious; it's dangerous. Like, the reason why Nixon imposed wage and price controls is because he had an election coming up, and it was really popular, and he won that election.
Tell me where you think we are in the idea of globalization, and whether the momentum is two ideas. One is that somehow the anti-globalization forces have gained some momentum. The other idea is that it's too late, and that globalization is a force that is here and irreversible.
Well, one of the things that I've been struggling with in this book and in previous writing is the ways in which ideas that are actually separate get bundled together, and trying to pry those ideas apart and say,
Did I just commit that sin?
Well, the phrase globalization is a funny word, right? I mean, it sort of incorporates everything from air travel to technology to free trade, and so if you bundle this all together,
the
then
diminishing of borders and everything else.
Yeah, and the so-called anti-globalization movement, I never used the phrase anti-globalization, because what was interesting about that movement, the Seattle, Genoa, all these huge protests around the world, was that they were themselves global, and that they represented a internationalism that was being facilitated by the very technologies, air travel, of the internet, that are at the heart of what most people think of when they think of globalization. What I believe those protests were about, and what I was writing at the time, was that they were about the globalization of this level of corporate power that was quite unprecedented, and that in fact they were protests against the very policies that I'm attributing to Friedman here in this book: privatization of every aspect of the state, deregulation in the interests of corporations, and hyper-regulation in the interests of those corporations, patent protections, intellectual property protections, and cuts to social spending, cuts to healthcare, education. So that's the policy program that is called different things in different parts of the world. In Latin America, they call it neoliberalism. So it's not a movement against globalization. It's a movement against the globalization of this radical corporate vision of the world.
Is it a movement against multinational corporations?
I think it's a vision against the merger of multinational corporations and governments. And that is really what was being identified. It's not that it's against the corporations themselves. It's against the restructuring of the world in the interests of those corporations. And so I would say that process is in crisis, that the World Trade Organization talks have been derailed for 4 years. The International Monetary Fund is facing a debt crisis of its own. The World Bank, as we know, is facing a real credibility crisis, and the whole Wolfowitz scandal was at the heart of, was a symptom of it, not the cause of it. And so these were the primary institutions. These three institutions, the WTO, the IMF, and the World Bank, were the institutions that spread these economic policies around the world, usually in exchange for a badly needed loans as a condition attached to a loan, or as the price of admission to the global economy, which is the way that the World Trade Organization works. If you want to be part of this club, you need to accept these rules. And that way of imposing those policies is clearly in crisis. But what I'm showing in this book is that there's a new way, and that is to, in the aftermath of a war, in the aftermath of a natural disaster, to use the period of shock to just push them through, and also to use the aid money that is needed in the aftermath of a natural disaster to once again push through these unwanted policies. And there's nothing less democratic than that. There's nothing less democratic than taking advantage of people when they are worried about whether they have water.
What do you say to, on the other hand, to, and I'm sure you've thought about this, at the time of Katrina, a company like Walmart received enormous applause across the board.
Yeah.
Do you recognize that? Do you agree with that? Do you find that an exception to the rule?
Well,
and how does that fit into your theory?
Well, I mean, Walmart is an extraordinarily efficient company. And I was, in New Orleans in this period reporting, and there's no doubt that they did better than FEMA at having basic supplies, having water, having blankets, having generators.
Is that a negative thing or a positive thing?
What's negative is that FEMA couldn't do it.
Okay, fine, fair enough.
No, but I mean, the context in which people were applauding Walmart in this moment was that the state was failing on every level. So that's how privatization becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Okay, but do we have any evidence that Walmart tried to take advantage of this situation in terms of its own economic welfare? I mean, it came to the aid and clearly, and there were other corporations did too. The point is every situation, after every disaster, every corporation, or a giant corporation, one of the biggest corporations in the world, Walmart, the biggest multinational corporation too, with a huge connection to China. After that disaster, did they move in and try to take advantage of it? Did they try to gain things that they couldn't because there was a crisis? Or did they simply act as a good citizen for?
Well, first of all, Walmart wasn't giving this away for free. I mean, Walmart,
I get, but they
were doing business, and there's nothing wrong with that.
No.
But what I think is dangerous is that
there was a public service there, according to people, friends of mine who were not corporate.
People were very grateful to
exactly.
But I mean, it wasn't charity.
I know, but it wasn't charity. But there were. I mean, it also. I mean, they reached out at a time when there was a natural disaster and did more than. I mean,
many companies.
It wasn't
did.
just
many
to make money. It wasn't
did.
just to make money. I would
there was
argue.
An unprecedented level of charitable giving from individuals and corporations in that moment.
Who did not reach out to achieve some advantage in terms of a market share.
But even if they did, even if they did.
You know the point I'm trying to make? The point I'm trying to make is everybody's not evil.
No, but corporations should look for advantage whenever they can. That's what they're built to do.
Okay, but that's an interesting debate. Is that your point too?
No,
that
it's not
by
my
the
point
nature
at all.
of
I have nothing against that.
Nothing against capitalism.
What the problem, the system that what we saw in New Orleans, and here's what I have a problem with, is that many people seeing the failure of the state and the efficiency of Walmart, we're actually saying things, well, why don't we just let Walmart take over FEMA? Now, that seems like a bit of a joke, but a year later, a private airline was launched, a charter air service was launched in Florida called HelpJet, with the slogan, "Turn your hurricane into a luxury vacation." And there's a whole new breed of companies out there, and Blackwater is among them, that see an expanding opportunity in the increasing numbers of natural disasters and all kinds of crises, but also the opportunity is created by the fact that the state is failing. Now, the fact that the state is failing is not a coincidence. It's part of the same ideological program. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The state is sort of starved out, inefficient,
but the state, Mississippi didn't fail. I mean, Mississippi gets reasonably high marks, does it not, for what happened as a response to Katrina?
Well, it didn't.
Certainly in contrast to New Orleans, and had a different circumstance.
It had a very different circumstance, but even the disaster itself in New Orleans was not a natural disaster. It was a collision between heavy weather and weakened infrastructure that just gave way.
The levees wouldn't hold.
And the public transit system was a mess, and there was no evacuation plan, and at every level, and FEMA couldn't seem to find the Superdome. So the failure of the state then becomes a new opportunity for privatization, and there are new companies being launched now, and their central message is there's more natural disasters, there's more terrorist threats, it's a scary place out there, and you can't count on the government. Many of the people who are saying this...
That's the message that comes out of what?
Oh, there's a new company called Sovereign Deed, which is really a privatized...
No.
No. No, I mean, this company, HelpJet, is saying, we saw what happened during Hurricane Katrina. You saw the line. It's a country club model. And during the California wildfires, there was privatized, as we know, there weren't enough planes in many parts of California. There weren't enough... firefighters. The National Guard was in Iraq, and there were private firefighters working for insurance companies, and this
doing what?
Putting out fires.
Right, exactly.
And so I don't think you can blame the companies for seeing an opportunity, but this cuts to the very heart of what a state is. This cuts to the heart of what do we expect from government? If you can't expect that in a disaster people have a right to equal treatment, people will be universally saved, and it won't just be who can afford to pay for escape.
There are two arguments here. I mean, we're commingling two arguments. On one hand, everybody has indicted the state for its behavior in the wake of Katrina.
Yeah.
Almost everybody.
Yes.
Even, and including some of the people who were involved. So clearly the state failed in lots of ways, and everybody's indicted. On the other hand, having nothing to do with that, but simply because there has been always greedy people who want to take advantage of other people's disaster, suffering. I mean, there's always somebody that and those are phenomenons of our experience. Do you believe there is an anti-capitalism critique that is gaining momentum?
Well, certainly in Latin America.
Well, let's look at Latin America. I mean, you've got Venezuela, Bolivia, and where else?
Well, in Latin America, they call it neoliberalism, and because they are making a distinction. I don't think in any of the countries that we could point to where there has been a leftward switch. Ecuador, for instance, elected Rafael Correa.
Right.
One of the first things he said when he was elected was, "I'm no fan of Milton Friedman."
But on that, we just had a new election in Argentina.
Yeah, and also in Chile.
Interesting, we have women running Argentina and Chile.
Yes.
That's very nice.
Kirchner and Bachelet.
Yeah.
So in these countries, these are not places where people want communism. They are not trying to eliminate private property or say that nobody should be allowed to go shopping.
Do they hate capitalism?
I think what is being rejected here is this ideology of leaving everything to the hands of the market. They do want intervention. They don't believe that essential services. I mean, in Bolivia, it's interesting because it really all began with this revolt against Bechtel, and it was over the issue of water, because water came to symbolize, and the slogan was "Water is life." And it comes back to this issue of, okay, it's fine to have a market. Capitalism is fine when it comes to buying shoes. But when it comes to surviving, whether it's healthcare or disaster response, and in Bolivia, the core issue was water, you can't leave it to the free market. In Bolivia, it became illegal, and Cochabamba became illegal to collect rainwater because it was seen as unfair competition for the privatized water companies. So this just became a symbol for taking this too far. And so I don't think it's a rejection of all forms of capitalism, but it is a rejection of what I call capitalist fundamentalism. and what they're building are mixed economies, some cooperatives, some a role for the state in all kinds of social programs, poverty alleviation, land reform. But the fact is, there are way more choices than we're so often led to believe. I mean, one of the things that really strikes me as I sort of try to present this book around the world is just this sort of this attempt to put us into these two boxes. It's either this very radical form of capitalism that is represented by Milton Friedman or the Heritage Foundation, let's just say, them. And on the other hand, this idea that it's totalitarian communism.
Milton Friedman would love the fact that we're sitting here and he's been dead 2 years debating him, his ideas. Where's the future? I mean, let's look at two places that are their economic explosion makes many people argue that we're looking at a century that moves to Asia. Take China, take India, and where does that fit in your theme?
Well, I mean, China is a pretty powerful example that challenges this central narrative that I'm talking about. The claim that free markets and free people go hand in hand. China is there.
Free markets, but not free people.
They skipped the whole democracy stage. Yeah. And what's so remarkable to me about what's going on in China is it really is the most successful capitalist economy in the world with the highest rates of growth, and it is doing it. I would argue, in large part, because it doesn't have democracy. And China has built its economy based on the fact that it has a workforce that has been willing to work in many cases for $1 a day, and that strikes are few and far between. Although that's beginning to change. And one of the things that's really striking to me when I wrote No Logo, I had a section about how so many of the large media companies were talking about how bringing new technologies to China would bring China democracy. You remember all that discourse in the 90s of satellite television. If you could have satellite television in China, authoritarian rule won't be able to hold. And now here we are, a decade later, and the big communications companies are collaborating with the Chinese government to put their own people under surveillance. So not only haven't these companies brought democracy to China, but they're actually...
This was a reflection of Yahoo, we just heard.
But not just Yahoo. I mean, but Yahoo's part of it, but in the Shenzhen province, for instance, you have really sci-fi experiments going on with high-tech surveillance, biometric IDs, network CCTV cameras, which are allowing people to be under surveillance all the time. So, they skip the democracy stage, and in fact, these companies, these security companies, are listed on the NASDAQ, and this is a new market.
Anthony Shadid, a journalist I respect greatly, said, "The Shock Doctrine is simply put a book without peer, an epic and riveting work whose message must be heard with the persistence of a journalist in the best sense of the word and the rigor of a scholar in his truest incarnation. Naomi Klein offers nothing short of a new paradigm for understanding." I mean, did you write this? Understanding politics.
In my inbox one day, like a gift from God.
Her book is honest, urgent, and necessary to read. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Great to have you on this program.
My pleasure.
Come back.
I will.
Anytime.
The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, Naomi Klein, her previous book, which many of you know, No Logo. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.